All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks once again for having me here at Countermeasure. As Karim mentioned, this is my third time presenting here, and it's an event I always really look forward to every year, so I'm excited to share this presentation with you all. So we're going to be talking about IOCs. We're going to be talking about threat data and threat intelligence and my perspective on it and how that's evolved over the years. But by way of quick background, and I will try not to repeat the same ground that Karim just covered, I live in Alexandria, Virginia, so just outside of the DC area. I've been there for about 13 years now, which is kind of an anomaly. Very few people. It's a very transient area. A lot of people move in and out as they do contracting work for the government or for businesses set there. But I've been there for over a decade now. I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers for about 5 years as a consultant, first in their federal practice, then in their private sector technology and security practice. Primarily doing security assessments, penetration testing, application security testing, and just the whole variety of one-off things that you get asked to do when you're a technical consultant focused on security in the Big Four. I then spent 6 more years as a consultant at Mandiant, left there as a technical director and lead for their incident response practice. That's where I kind of shifted from focusing on offense to defense and investigations and forensics, and primarily led a lot of investigations for nation-state attacks, targeted intrusion cases and the like. And for the last year and a half or so, I've been with Tanium, where I both work with our product team on helping build and shape what we do in the security space, as well as run an internal team that does a mixture of engineering and consulting type work. I'm a contributing author to Incident Response and Computer Forensics. I wrote the Investigating Windows portion of that a couple years ago. And as Karim mentioned, I was a tech consultant for last season of Mr. Robot, and I'm currently working with the production and writing team on season 3, actually right now, every night pretty much. So let's go back to 2010. In 2010, I was doing a presentation at MITRE, I believe, about indicators of compromise. And this was a couple years into my tenure at Mandiant. And we were talking about the need to have an IOC format, to have an indicator of compromise format, because we were plagued with this challenge of inefficient and unsuccessful information sharing about threats. And so the thing we bemoaned was that everyone had been sharing threat data in these flat, static, really brittle lists of hashes and IPs that had no context, no grouping, no intelligence. And indicator of compromise formats like OpenIOC were going to magically fix all of these problems. And the goal of IOCs, as opposed to just flat, unstructured data, was to produce human-readable and yet machine-consumable forms of threat data, to expand the width or breadth of the types of forensic artifacts that we were going to share and capture, and to provide more context around groupings of observables rather than just provide lists with no information about how they related or what they actually meant, to do better than signatures, in short. And so you fast forward 6 years to now, and we've got a whole multitude of different standards for different levels and ways of expressing threat indicators, everything from Cybox to Yara, OpenIOC, STIX. And then we've got actually a much greater number of organizations, both private and public, dedicated to distributing, sharing, generating threat indicators. In the US, we have quite a few that are industry vertical aligned. So you've got like FS-ISAC for the financial services group, DIB-ISAC for the defense industrial base. And then alongside with that, there's more and more government agencies across all of the major Western nations that are working with private sector to foster information sharing and that public-private exchange. And so with all of this, what does information sharing and IOCs look like in 2016? And I just took snippets from 5 or 6 different IOC sets from some of the major organizations that share them. And I know this is going to be small back there, but hopefully you can at least see one thing, which is the shape of this data. It is flat lists of hashes and IP addresses. They happen to be in an IOC format, but it's the exact same thing that we were trying to get away from. And I find that really interesting. And part of what I wanted to talk about today is, why is that? Why is that we've invested so much time and effort and money in creating these codified formats to share and capture threat data, and yet we're still basically doing the exact same thing? And as part of that perspective, my own viewpoint has evolved just as I've changed roles and jobs. When I was an investigator, I spent a lot of time designing and testing and even building mechanisms to automatically generate IOCs for both proactive and reactive hunting. But in kind of a context of expert teams that do this day in and day out. For the last 2 years, I've been more of a builder role where I'm really thinking more about working with organizations that are trying to take on this capability themselves or integrate this capability through third-party sources like third-party threat streams. And it's really eye-opening to see a lot of the challenges that organizations face as they take in and buy these threat streams and what they're actually finding they get as a return on investment on that. Just as a show of hands here, how many of you work for an organization that is currently paying money for third-party threat data? I see a few hands. I know we've got a decent number of folks in government here. How many of you are actually producing threat data to share among your peers or private public sector? I see one hesitant hand at least. Yeah, this is still really young, right? This is still evolving, and this is part of why I wanted to put this presentation together, because I think we're at an inflection point where people are making really important decisions about where they invest and what they build and what they share. And it's across that backdrop that I wanted to provide some of this perspective. And really what I'm seeing is that there has been an erosion of indicator-based threat detection. And part of that is just reality versus expectations and resetting what we actually think we're going to get out of threat data. It begins with brittle indicators that are much, much less flexible than we hoped they would be and have a much shorter effective shelf life. Poor quality control. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you actually get when you pay for some of these so-called professional threat feed services. The challenge of building effective homegrown IOCs. Building good threat data yourself is far harder than I think I even appreciated a couple of years ago. Inconsistencies in the tools that apply threat data, and this is particularly salient for endpoint, because endpoint tends to be a little more complex in terms of the sheer scope of observables that you're trying to ingest and handle and map against the state of an endpoint system. So we'll talk about that. Applying IOCs to too limited a scope of data, meaning you can have the best intelligence in the world, but if you're applying it through a peephole in your environment, you're going to miss a whole lot of stuff. And so these are some of the challenges we're going to talk about before we talk about some ways to actually do better. And we'll begin with why IOCs are brittle. And I touched on some of these points earlier, but I want to qualify one thing first, and that's really a terminology thing that I will probably be guilty of violating in this presentation, but it's important to lay this out. So IOCs versus threat data versus intelligence. IOCs are structured threat data. Threat data is not the same as threat intelligence. Threat data are the technical observables like an IP or a hash or a registry key. Threat intelligence is context analysis about a collection of observables, a collection of IOCs, along with who and how they are being used by a threat actor. Threat intelligence is really important to help make risk-based decisions about attacks and incidents and what you need to worry about. But I will also argue that threat intelligence is ineffective without high-quality threat data that accompanies it. You can spend every single day of the year reading PDFs of white papers by CrowdStrike and FireEye and Cisco and every other vendor that puts out, this is the latest threat group you need to worry about. This is what, I don't know, Fancy Bear or Sad Panda or Party Parrot or APT38 is doing. But you're never going to make yourself more secure. You're never going to operationalize a PDF of data across all of your environments at the pace or cadence you need to. So quality threat data is absolutely necessary for all that context and intelligence to actually be useful. So let's look at the DBIR from last year. I think I'm seeing a trend here that it's like obligatory to have at least one DBIR slide. So this is mine. Most shared IOC types. And this is probably going to be a bit small in the back of the room, but I'll tell you that the numbers here show that IP addresses, file hashes, and DNS names are the most common across every single information sharing group, both private and public, that Verizon DBIR tracked in 2015. If you go to the APT notes data set, this is kind of an interesting data set for unstructured threat data. It lives on GitHub, and it's basically a compilation of every single threat report that every security vendor puts out. They have hundreds and hundreds of these, and they've extracted out all of the data into one spot. And so I ran some numbers and found, like, how many host names are in here, how many URLs. And if you look at the graphs again, the vast majority of the data being shared in these reports are hashes, file names, IP addresses, DNS names, and URLs. So we are sharing the same really brittle static data that we all know as industry practitioners changes incredibly fast. The lifespan of a malware hash is incredibly short. The lifespan of a C2 IP address is incredibly short. And that is all we continue to share. And what I also find interesting is that we seem to be pursuing this notion, and I think this is coming from a lot of the anti-malware companies out there, that we're going to solve this problem with the cloud and more rapid analysis and big data. And so I did some digging in history and wanted to see, like, what were we doing 7 or 8 years ago? So 7 or 8 years ago, actually as far as 10 years ago, Bit9 was tracking 4 billion unique executable files, DLLs, drivers, and adding about 50 million entries per day. That's in 2007. 2009, McAfee launches their Global Threat Intelligence Initiative and is claiming to track 140 million IP addresses and do 50 million file lookups per day. In 2011, Symantec talked about tracking tens of billions of linkages between users, files, and websites. And clearly, we haven't had a single impactful breach from 2009 till today with all of this great data at our disposal. So if billions and billions of these things didn't solve the problem 5 or 6 years ago, there's no way in hell it's going to make a difference now. And so I'm really skeptical when I see a lot of the practitioners in security espousing that there is going to be an intelligence-led revolution in how we handle information security. Because I think, and I'll talk later about how IOCs and threat data are really important as part of an ecosystem, but to make this notion that intelligence-led security is going to change everything belies the fact that we were saying the exact same thing 7 years ago. The quote on the left here is from Dave DeWalt at McAfee, and I'm not picking on him or McAfee as, you know, being the only one saying this, but this is a history lesson. 7 years ago, McAfee is talking about revolutionizing security with global threat intelligence and this vast network of sensors and threat data. And then in 2016 at FireEye, he's saying the exact same thing. An intelligence-led approach is going to help us predict attacks. It didn't then, and it's really not going to change things now. So with that in mind, let's talk about whether what you're paying for in terms of threat data is actually effective. I work with a lot of organizations that have looked at the paid feeds and the free feeds, and I'll often get the question of, like, is there a marked difference in quality between paid and free? And the answer usually is yes. A lot of the free feeds out there, like, you know, if you go to a site like Hail a Taxi, you're going to see a really, really poor signal-to-noise ratio. But what I found disappointing as I started to dig into this is the sheer lack of quality that you'll actually find in most of the major threat intelligence sources that you can subscribe to. And I'm not going to name any names here. I'm not going to call attention to one vendor because it's actually a complicated problem to solve. But I actually want to show you some examples and get you thinking about the fundamental question here, which is if you are paying for feeds or if you're thinking about it in the future, how are you going to assess data quality in that feed? There's a quote here from an analyst at ESG from last year, 2015, where he tried to survey this and found 74% of professionals in our industry said it was extremely difficult to determine the quality and efficacy of an individual threat intelligence feed. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So my incredibly non-scientific methodology for this was to choose two top tier, so I would say, like, if you were to do Magic Quadrant, they'd be all the way in the top right, leading threat intelligence services. I grabbed the most recent 20 indicators from each, and I spent 15 minutes looking at them. This was literally all I did. So from my incredibly scientific sampling approach here, let's look at what I found. Like the second indicator I found, and this is actually a very common pattern in a lot of threat intel services, is hashing or taking the malware hash and grouping it in an AND block with a file name. So if you've ever looked at OpenIOC, you have this notion of logic trees and ORs and ANDs. When you AND the hash with a file name, it means that the indicator will never ever match unless the hash and the file name are both set exactly as expressed in the indicator. Well, that's silly, right? Like, if I have the hash, who cares what the file name is? I mean, the whole point of the hash is to reliably fingerprint the file regardless of what its name is. By ANDing it with the file name, I've just basically guaranteed that this indicator is far more brittle than it already would be. And that is in a paid feed. I like this one. This probably came out of a sandbox and never had a set of eyeballs on it. So this is a link file. And the block here has the link file name, the size, and the hashes all grouped together. So for this IOC to hit, you have to have a link file with this size and those hashes. If you've ever done Windows forensics, you'll know that a link file, inside it, contains a bunch of metadata, including the volume GUID of the file path that it's pointing to. That volume GUID will never exist on any other system except what produced the link file in the first place. So this IOC will never match on any other box in the universe except the sandbox that spitted it out the first time. These indicators are both, again, open IOC format, and if you've ever done any work with Python or Py to Windows or Py to Exe type stuff, you've probably seen like the Win32 Python PYD files that you get as artifacts of that. And what happened probably here is that there was a malware sample that used Python to exe or some framework that allowed Python code to run in Windows. And so we have legitimate components of Python libraries here with hashes that you would find in lots of developer systems, because these are legit files, but they're artifacts probably of some malware that happened to use these same dependencies. So this is basically tantamount to taking a legitimate Windows DLL and shoving it in an IOC. And so I look at this, and then I'm really horrified when I hear people talking about, automatically triggering remediation actions when an IOC matches. We've all seen what happens when an AV update accidentally puts SVC host as malware, and you end up bricking every single Windows host in your environment. The same thing could happen at scale with bad IOCs if you don't realize that this is some of the stuff coming through your feeds. So this lack of quality assurance really concerns me. On the flip side, from having spent a lot of time building IOCs myself, I certainly appreciate why building good IOCs is difficult. David Bianco has a presentation that he's iterated on for a few years called The Pyramid of Pain, which is a really nice way of concisely explaining the challenge from starting with the very basic observables like hashes and IPs, as you move up to trying to create more expressive, more reliable, less brittle indicators that capture tactics and tools and methodologies of an attacker, it gets really, really hard to do that. And the reason a lot of these threat data feed companies provide IOCs that are just hashes or IPs is it's a reduction down to a common denominator that's reliable. If you are providing a threat data feed and you have a really smart, clever IOC that produces a bunch of false positives, your consumers get annoyed. And it's hard to produce abstract methodology indicators without having the context of billions of systems worth of data to compare them to on a constant basis. So everyone just goes back to the lowest common denominator of let's just spit out hashes and IPs because at least no one will complain that it's a false positive most of the time. This is an example, and again, this might be a bit small for those in the back, but if you've ever looked at a robust OpenIOC indicator, OpenIOC is really interesting. It's got like hundreds of different observable types. You can build a combination of a file import table object and an exported function and the PE type and the hashes and registry artifacts and memory artifacts. But who actually spends the time building IOCs like this for every single incident that matters? Consultancies and investigative firms can certainly do so. But if you're running a SOC or CERT team, even if you've got a full-blown CERT team, there's no way you're going to have analysts constantly trying to iterate on this stuff and ever keep up. That's why you pay for third-party threat feeds. But again, from the producer end, they're blindly sending these indicators out and hoping they don't cause a ton of false positives. And when you start to get experimental like this, that's when you start to produce a lot of noise, and people get angry that you're not giving them the fidelity that they want. Specific to endpoint indicator matching, there's another challenge, which is inconsistencies in IOC detection tools. And I think this comes from the fact that OpenIOC, and even to a lesser extent Stix and Cybox, defined observables without defining the actual way to evaluate systems for said observables. And so when you look at tools on the endpoint side that are trying to consume different forms of threat intelligence, what you'll probably find is incredible inconsistency in how they're ingesting and applying that threat data. It begins with supported observables. If you're paying for an IOC feed that is giving you things like scheduled task items or registry keys, and all you're capable of doing is matching file names and file hashes, then you're blind to a chunk of the threat data that you're getting in that feed. The second thing is logic handling. If you've got OpenIOCs or Stix or Cybox observables that are implementing this logic tree, are you confident your endpoint tool is actually evaluating that logic tree and not short-circuiting it in a way that's going to produce unexpected behavior? There's no spec that defines how to do that in OpenIOC. You just have to figure it out and hope that everything works. And then most importantly, and this is where I see a lot of both third-party feeds, homegrown IOCs, and vendor tools all fail, is data normalization. What do you do when you get an indicator that has % system root or % user in it? What do you do if you've got an indicator that's for a redirected file path because of WoW64 behavior in Windows? Like if your IOC matching tool is 32-bit and you're running on 64-bit Windows, are you accounting for file system redirection? If you've got an indicator that matches to volatile state data like HKey current user, HKey current user doesn't exist in the Windows registry. HKey users and a SID does. Is your tool mapping against the static registry or the hives as they're mapped in memory? If you got an IOC with this, are you going to miss and false negative because your tool isn't properly capturing it? Again, there's no standard that defines how you should do this. Every vendor has to figure it out and do their own thing. Now, the fortunate thing, and this is by product of them coming from a true standards organization and not a vendor, but Styx and Cybox, which both came out of MITRE through joint work with US government, do have a few tools for data normalization. Make to Styx, and there's a Python Cybox framework that is a script called normalize. You can run this across your threat data and get more normalized, reliable output if you're working in those formats. But I don't think many organizations out there are actually doing that. OpenIOC itself is a world of hurt. And again, OpenIOC was kind of first to market with a format like this, so I really can't pick on them too hard. But OpenIOC was basically created out of the output format of MIR, Mandiant Intelligent Response. And so when you try to create a schema or standard after a proprietary vendor tool's weird XML output format, you get indicator terms like process item / port list / port item / process. Process, port, process. What the hell does that mean? I mean, I know what it means because I've worked with the technology, so I know that it's the port held by a process as parsed out of process memory, but that's not at all intuitive if I'm just trying to figure out, you know, how the heck do I have an indicator term to map a port held open by a process? Or file item PE info detected anomalies string. If you read the description, it's like string for detected anomalies in the PE headers. Well, what are those strings? Does every tool produce the same string? Do you have a map that you can give me so that I can consistently evaluate this or use this term? This is a significant problem, and this is another reason why you see so many indicators just dumb themselves down to hashes and IPs, because no one can deal with this stuff. So we talked about indicators being brittle. We talked about some of the market forces that unfortunately lead to really poor indicators being shared and sold, as well as the reason why building good indicators is hard. Let's now talk a little bit about both challenges and opportunities to do better and shift the conversation to things that are more productive and positive. And I'll begin with widening the scope of endpoint indicator usage. So the fundamental question, and I'm going to stick to endpoint here, is what can you see? So you've got endpoint-centric threat data. What are you matching it against? And the way I always like to articulate this is you've got domains of data and domains of systems. Domains of data are in three categories. The current volatile state of your systems, which is essentially what's in memory. So what processes are running, what network connections are active, what objects are serialized in memory. Historical activity, so this is the sort of like telemetry feed that a lot of security tools produce of a rolling set of historical events. What files changed, what processes ran, what network connections previously were created, what users previously logged in. So telemetry. And then third is data at rest. So objects sitting on the system, not currently in use, not currently active, like a file on disk that's been there for 5 years, or a registry key or a line in an event log. So that is your scope of data that provides opportunities for threat data matching. And then where can you see that? You've got your workstations and your servers. I'll define workstations as end user computing devices and servers as everything else that powers your IT infrastructure. So this is what you need to be evaluating against, and the questions become, well, you know, what's your scope, what's your cadence of detection, where are your gaps, and where can you do in-place detection versus needing to build data lakes to facilitate using your threat data. And no one wants to build more data lakes where they can avoid it. So first thing that you'll often see is matching on the SIEM. And this is just born from the fact that SIEM usually gets stood up to ingest network data because it's easier, like there's fewer sources of network data than endpoint data. So when you stand up a SIEM, what you'll usually find is you'll have your web proxy logs, your firewall logs, maybe your network malware appliance feeding into it. And then on the endpoint side, it's a lot more sparse. You get like maybe your antivirus and HIPS alerts and maybe your Active Directory logons, maybe some critical application servers, but you don't get comprehensive coverage. Like, you can't reliably say, I'm going to give you a hash for a file at rest in the environment. Will I find that in the SIEM? Well, of course you won't, because no one's forwarding from every machine in their environment everything that's on them to the SIEM continuously. You'd be making Splunk very, very rich if you did that. So SIEM is great for what you can centrally capture, but that is a very small subset of what you need to do on the endpoint. Forensic telemetry is where a lot of the EDR market has gone. So the notion of just having a recorder on the endpoint that continuously captures events and then keeps it locally or streams it up to some place where you can say, did this process run 5 minutes ago or 5 days ago, and you can find it in some sort of data set. And that's really great. Like, that accelerates incident response, and it's a great opportunity for threat data matching because you capture all those short-lived events, like a password dumper that ran for a minute. You've got its hash, you've got its metadata, it's recorded, it's captured, you're good to match it against your threat info. The challenge is it's still a limited scope of data, meaning you're keeping a rolling window of things that have changed in your environment. That doesn't help you with finding things in your environment that existed before you installed that tool. That doesn't help you find things in your environment that are outside the window of time that you can centrally preserve that historical data. And it doesn't help you with artifacts that you don't keep in the telemetry feed. Like, no telemetry feed for any EDR tool records every event log entry in every operating system event log. It doesn't record every object in memory, like every mutex as processes start and stop, because all of a sudden your telemetry feed would become 1,000 times larger. So you do narrow your scope of data. Matching on live endpoints is the third domain, and this gives you, in some respects, the broadest opportunity, because if you're keeping telemetry and you have access to the live system, you can do things like look across memory, look across disk, look across telemetry feeds, but you have to consider other factors like endpoint impact. Is this process taking hours and hours and slowing down your systems to a point where it's unacceptable and you can't apply your threat data effectively? Is your environment available such that you can use your threat data and reliably cover most of your systems? And does this process scale? Can you do this across 1,000 hosts? Can you do it across 100,000? These are all really important considerations that balance what you do on the endpoint versus what you might need to do in a data lake or in a SIEM. For me personally, I like combining the SIEM and live endpoint. I think the SIEM can continue to exist and be enriched with more endpoint data. But I also think that there's a place for doing certain work on the endpoint, because as we grow and as systems become more geographically distributed and networks become less like one monolith cloud, I treat this as a distributed computing problem. And uptime is much more guaranteed now than it was a few years ago. Like, if someone's doing work on their computer, it's almost always online. And that provides an opportunity for distributed computing and distributed handling of this threat data and endpoint evidence problem. So with that, let's talk about shrinking the detection gap. And what I mean by the detection gap is really the misaligned expectations from what you think you're going to get from threat intelligence and IOCs versus what you're actually going to get. And for me, the challenge here that I see is organizations expected threat data and IOCs to do better than signatures. And between your AV signatures and your IOCs, you can suddenly close the gap of undetected threats. That was the promise. That's what we aspired to. What I have seen in practice is that threat data and IOCs and reputation data sources, at their best, are basically keeping us at parity with where we would have been 10 years ago with, like, signatures. So as attacks are evolving, use of threat data is just keeping our head a little bit above water. It is not closing the gap of undetected threats, and it will not do so. And the reason I want to point that out is, like, just like people will sometimes disparage antivirus as being useless, and that's completely wrong. Antivirus gives you an enormous amount of noise reduction and automated handling of stuff that you'd otherwise be wasting SOC and CERT analyst time on. That's a good thing. Like, the problem is when you expect AV signatures to stop all unknown attacks or new novel attack techniques, and we're making the same mistake now with threat data and what we expect of it. Rick Holland at Forrester, who Tyler mentioned earlier at this morning's keynote, he was at Forrester at the time. Now he's at a different firm, but he had a really good quote this year at the 2016 CTI Summit. There's this desire he was talking about to take a technical feed, dump it into your security infrastructure, and you just get a threat intelligence win, and you're going to find all this new stuff. And the reality is that that approach completely ignores the benefit of getting threat data from your own environment, meaning monitoring your environment to understand what is normal, what is a baseline, what is a diff from that. And that really provides incredible opportunity to complement threat data and external threat feed-centric mechanisms of finding if you're compromised. So it begins with, do you know the basics in your network? And I spent a while thinking about how I could distill down the most important things that you really need to care about to detect the modern state of breaches in most environments. And it's really three things. What are your privileged accounts doing? Meaning your local administrators, your domain administrators, where are they logging on? How are they logging on? From and to which systems at which times? The second is use of OS native tools that are commonly abused by attackers. Because the reality is attackers at this point live off the land. If you ever look at the presentations by like folks at the Veris group, great group of consultants, Matt Graber, Casey Smith, they all do fantastic work on PowerShell and other mechanisms of using native Windows features for offensive security, for bypassing controls, for bypassing things like app whitelisting. And it's really emblematic of what attackers are doing now. The nice thing is legitimate users don't run a lot of these OS native tools. How many users in your environment know how to open a command line, let alone all of the esoteric arguments that the net command has, or how to invoke PowerShell with execution policy bypassed? There's a lot of opportunity to find anomalies from the fact that most of the OS native tools that attackers leverage are used by your admins and developers, but really no one else. And then the third is persistence mechanisms, meaning if you have a reliable way to track the ways that attackers or things can survive in your network and persist through reboot, through user logon, even remote access, like do you have Citrix gateways exposed in your DMZ? Do you have single-factor VPN for your contractors? These are all ways that attackers survive in a network. And if you can analyze and track changes to what's persisting in different ways, you have opportunities to detect a lot of unknown. And so this all goes to employing a blended approach, which is, yes, pursue IOCs and reputation data as a mechanism for noise reduction and for automated context, so that if I do have a hash that hit, I know that it's associated with a certain threat group, and I can make a risk-informed decision on whether I'm going to spin up an IR or just clobber the system, remediate, and move on with my life. The second is pattern of attack detection for common intrusion workflows. And I think the nice thing here is that we have a surfeit of EDR tools. It's not like 10 years ago where you basically just had to spend hours scanning each system one by one and looking for artifacts, like whether it be Tanium or other commercial vendors or open source tools or native OS stuff like Sysmon or stuff like Google Rapid Response. There are tons of things out there that you can use to start building out endpoint visibility and apply it to look for patterns of attack rather than just using all of this cool tooling to look for hashes and file names. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about some examples of applying that in a practical way. And then finally, anomaly and outlier analysis. And I'll touch on this a little bit, but the idea here is not to try to just find anomalies among the millions of haystacks that you have in your environment, but to pick discrete sets of systems and users and compare them to one another in ways that can surface interesting things in the three items I mentioned in the previous slide. What your privileged users are doing, what's persisting, and how are native OS capabilities being used or abused. So let's talk about the middle one there, patterns of attack. When I talk about looking for patterns of attack as opposed to specific indicators, I like to think of it as what are the lowest common denominators that you see threat actors, both targeted and opportunistic, apply across intrusions. And these often just end up being defined by the way corporate networks and the most common operating systems in those networks behave. I'm going to use Windows as an example here because most corporate environments still remain largely Windows-centric. And that is the opportunity for the attacker. They know how Windows works, they know how Active Directory works, and that's very predictable from environment to environment. So that results in some outlier conditions that we can look for and track from incident to incident. So let's bear this out. Before I give you a specific example, I wanted to call attention to a framework by MITRE called ATT&CK. Earlier, if you saw Andrew Hayes' talk, he talked about the CIS top 20 benchmarks for implementing effective security and how the Australian Signals Directorate said if you employed the top 4 of those, you'd cover 85% of threats. I think this is an interesting angle on this that MITRE has recently put out about mechanisms of attack across each phase of the attack lifecycle and the techniques that are employed. And if you look this up, you'll get a really nice single-page table of all the different mechanisms used for persistence, for privilege escalation, all the way through to things like data exfiltration and command and control. Really good reference as you're trying to align your efforts across what I mean when I say patterns of attack. The only downside to this framework is right now there's no prioritization to it. There's no ordering to it, so a persistence mechanism that is incredibly obscure and esoteric is listed with equal footing as one that might be used in 80 or 90% of breaches. That's something I'm hoping to help work towards sharing more information about, really, like what are the top 3 in each of these categories you should tackle first. But let's take an example of this that I really enjoy talking about, which is detecting host-to-host command execution. So we're going to talk about a post-breach scenario where you've got at least one infected system, an attacker foothold of some sort, and you've got an attacker with an administrator account that lets them hop around a couple hosts. Maybe it's a shared local administrator, maybe it's a moderately privileged domain account. Now, if you look in a Windows breach at how attackers run commands from system B, or from system A to system B, I think about the hundreds of cases that I've worked or been exposed to, and almost every single one of them uses one of these 3 or 4 methods. Remote scheduled tasks, Windows Remote Management or PowerShell, PS exec, and if I were to add one more, WMI, remote command execution. These are 4 essentially native to Windows ways to run a command on a remote host if you have privileges to it and you're already inside the network. You don't need to ship malware down to the host. I mean, okay, PS exec is not part of Windows, but it's a widely used administration tool that would not raise eyebrows in most environments. So you don't need to bring Metasploit down to a box to do this stuff, and this is a great example of living off the land. The nice thing is when you use all of these tools, you leave behind a ton of evidence. You create logon events when you run remote scheduled task, or even PowerShell remoting or PS exec, you're creating network logons on the target host. You might be creating explicit logon events on the source host. If you do process telemetry, like with Sysmon or lots of commercial tools that record historical event tracking, you're going to have execution of these commands that, again, normal users don't typically run on their own. And then there's lots of other artifacts over the network in memory and so on. But even just these top 2 here are readily available, readily parsable if you have any modern EDR tool deployed in your environment. And this will give you coverage of 90% of the ways, if not more, that attackers move from host to host. And so what you do with all this data is then apply analysis criteria to it. So on a rolling basis, can you reliably track who, like which accounts, are using these methods in your environments, both for good and bad, where they're occurring from source and destination, at what time they usually occur, and what they actually run. So what are the scheduled tasks in my environment executing? What files are they dropping? And this gives you neat little stacks of data where you can start to do outlier analysis. And just as Andrew was mentioning in his building a security team talk, the idea is to take small chunks and small problems and then build out a hunting capability piece by piece. And you could just start with scheduled tasks as an example of this. And scheduled tasks remain really, really prevalent for attacker behavior in Windows environments. So let's use Dooku 2.0 as an example. Kaspersky, AV vendor, got breached by a threat actor that was pretty sophisticated. And they actually published a nice tell-all about what the attacker did and what their tools and tactics were. And this campaign used some malware that is called the Dooku family. And in particular, their white paper described how the attackers would use scheduled tasks to run a dropper component of this malware named MSI exec remotely. And so when they would do that, it would create this event log in the task scheduler event log in Windows saying, task scheduler created this task named MSI exec. And they even mentioned that this is similar behavior that the attackers did back in 2011. So for 5 years, they've been employing this technique. So what was really funny to me is if you went and looked at the IOCs that Kaspersky shared or FireEye or any of the other vendors, I think this is Kaspersky's on screen. The IOC doesn't have a single task item or anything about scheduled task metadata in it. It's a list of hashes and IP addresses. Like literally, this is the whole indicator. Exactly the problem we talked about earlier. So we could do better than this, right? We could maybe add a task item to the IOC. That's part of Open IOC spec. We could look for scheduled tasks that run MSI exec and start to do some outlier analysis. But maybe that's still a bit specific, and maybe we want to take a step back further and think about the problem holistically, which is if attackers are using scheduled tasks so consistently across breaches as a common mechanism of lateral command execution, how could we just in general build a process to find this stuff? So let's look at the analysis approach for event logs. Every single Windows computer in your environment is recording whenever a task is created, the user that created it, and what thing it ran. And that log is really small. It's like 10 megabytes. So you can harvest that using Windows native event forwarding or pick your favorite EDR tool, and you can create a stack that says which users create tasks in your environment and how many do they create over a period of time. So get a profile of what accounts in your environment are actually creating these things. You can also create a stack by what your tasks are executing. So when a scheduled task runs, what programs are they running? And this is important because you're going to have stuff like Google's native updater for Chrome, which creates a scheduled task. You're going to have like patches and ad hoc system administration tasks, all stuff that your admins are doing legitimately to manage the environment and should be largely common over time and at scale to give you some notion of prevalence and frequency of occurrence. And this will already start to bubble up the one-offs that seem more interesting, like a task named one.bat or test.bat or dump.bat or something in a temp directory that might warrant further investigation and further analysis. And that's where you then go back to the full log context and say, who ran what at which time? And you can start to mark off for future hunting recycling of this effort as this is known good, this was marked as commodity bad. You have a baseline of your environment to hunt with for future analysis. And maybe you do this across a 1-month effort, and then you can start doing it in an automated fashion and script it. And soon you have such a good baseline that when you are working a targeted breach, you're not looking at this data for the first time and freaking out at every single uncommon good outlier that you find in your network. You can also do this at rest. So if you have EDR tools, you can do stuff like survey what scheduled tasks exist on your endpoint now and what commands they run. And again, these are files that are sitting on every computer in your network. It is incredibly cheap and efficient to get at this data. It takes a split second to parse this out and see you've got a task named @1 in your environment and it's running something named drop.exe. And then finally, monitoring in motion. If you have telemetry feeds, it's really easy to start looking for some of the native Windows commands that attackers love to abuse. And for scheduled tasks, it's stuff like the command or the sch tasks command. Again, most of your users don't know that this even exists. So profiling whenever someone runs @//, you don't need to pay a third-party vendor for an indicator or pattern of attack for that. Like, this is easy to monitor for. And there are a dozen or two commands like this that will give you incredible blanket coverage of a lot of lateral movement techniques employed by attackers. So let's look at another example of this, which is stacking binaries. So a lot of people, when they try to do anomaly analysis, which was kind of the third phase of what I described, really overwhelm themselves with data. And I think the most common thing people will chase first that gets them hung up is they wonder how many unique executable files, DLLs, drivers are in my environment. And couldn't I just find malware by looking for that exe or DLL by name or hash that is unique or relatively uncommon? Because shouldn't most of my users have largely similar binaries on their endpoints? And the answer is absolutely not. Even in a small environment, the amount of noise here is like breathtaking. You will see probably 10 to 100 times more uniqueness than you expect. And that's because of different operating system versions and add-ons. It's getting even worse now that Windows does like slipstream updates where some users get some versions of a file and other users get other versions. User installed applications, if you've got admin or users with admin that can install applications, yeah, have fun with all the variants in your environment there. But then you've got stuff that you never think of until you look at the data. Like applications that like to drop files in directories with a GUID in their file name or their file path. I think for a while WebEx did this, where if you ever look at the binaries for WebEx, there's like a helper to the extension that's an executable file that lives in a directory with at least a partial GUID in its file name, which means if you're trying to do stack analysis of executables or names or directories, you're going to have a billion of these unique one-offs for every time someone spawned off the Cisco WebEx extension. All of this creates a lot of noise, and in many cases, unfortunately, dissuades people from pursuing data analysis like this because it's just so intrinsically hard to do right. One of the things that can help, it doesn't solve the problem, but it can help, is to start by, again, approaching a manageable stack of data when you build a hunting program. So I have a small demo environment that we use in our own company of a couple hundred Windows servers and workstations, and they're largely configured the same. And I just wanted to show you what I mean about just the noise that you deal with. So among these 250 systems, if you were to enumerate all of the loaded DLLs and XCs and drivers in memory, that small pool of systems has 2,490 unique files, unique based on path and hash. If instead of looking, and that's a lot of data, right? That's on only 250 largely alike systems, I already have 2,500 rows of things to look for. The long tail is going to be pretty big on that. Imagine in a network of 10,000 systems. Imagine on a network of 100,000 systems. I worked an investigation where we did this like file path uniqueness analysis for binaries in a network of about 75,000 hosts. And if my memory serves right, we had about 25 million unique XE paths by name and hash. That's an incredible amount of data, and you'll never find outliers effectively in that. So let's look at a slightly smaller data set. What if instead of looking at all loaded modules with hash and memory, I only look at things that are configured to automatically run or load? I only have 355 things to look at as opposed to 2,500. That's a little better. Instead of all auto start programs, what if I just focus on Windows services, which are a very common Windows persistence mechanism for malware? I only have 225 unique things to start looking at and monitoring. And what if I want to go really extreme and pick a more obscure but increasingly popular and covert persistence mechanism like WMI event consumers? Now I've only got 4 unique things that I'm tracking across an entire environment because there's very few Windows event consumers or WMI consumers that the OS natively creates. And so it's a lot easier to find an outlier in 4 things. So you can take on manageable bite-sized chunks of data and then build your way up from that and get a nice baseline understanding of how your environment works in the meantime. The other key here is to compare alike assets. If you're trying to hunt and do anomaly analysis across users or systems and you're comparing against the whole estate, you're always going to get overwhelmed with too much noise and too much of a long tail. In this example, I'm showing you auto start programs across a mix of workstations, servers, laptops, and we've got 308 unique entries. If I only compare auto runs against things that are SQL servers in my environment, I've only got 71 unique things. So think about that from a monitoring perspective. It's going to be a lot more effective for you to look for unique persistence mechanisms across your domain controllers as a group, across your database servers as a group, across your administrator workstations than it is to just compare against everything. And if you start to think about your environment in terms of logical units like that, it becomes a lot easier to proactively detect anomalies than to just try to tackle the whole set of data at once. I have a whole other presentation that's kind of complementary to this. It has some overlapping content, but then a bunch more technical examples. It's called Hunting in the Dark. It's on my speaker deck account. So if you'd like to read a bit more about this, do check that out. But let's wrap up with a few closing thoughts and takeaways. So one of the things I also wanted to share is where things are going in terms of standards and platforms that solve some of these endemic issues with good threat data sharing and usage. And there are a few things that I like out there. Has anyone heard of or used MISP before? 2 hands. So MISP is Malware Information Sharing Platform, I think. It is an open platform for consuming threat data and threat feeds. It gives you information and analysis and comparison of what you're ingesting, and it provides mechanisms to then shunt that off to some of the other tools in your environment. It is a really nice platform with Sultra recently announcing effectively that they're EOLing. It's probably one of the most mature remaining open platforms for threat data collection out there. So I suggest you check that out. For threat hubs and exchanges, everyone knows about the public sector and industry vertical specific exchanges out there. I'm unfortunately not too familiar with the exchanges in Canada, but I'm sure if they don't exist that the government's working to build some of those. On the private sector, there's one that I want to give a plug for because I really like how they're approaching this, and that's Facebook. So Facebook's been running Threat Exchange for 2 years. They have a couple hundred members across lots of different industries. And Facebook does a really good job with how they've built their graph to consume and manage and rate and score threat data. Probably the most, I would say, mature approach that I've seen in industry to tackling this problem. And so they are free. You have to just agree to certain terms to join and to share info if you want to, but they run a great program. And then from standards, I beat up a bit on Open IOC. I didn't talk a lot about sticks and Cybox. I mean, show of hands here, how many of you have worked with Cybox before? Yeah, I'm so sorry. Like it's not pleasant because when they built those standards, they built them to try to encompass so many edge cases and use cases that you ended up with hundreds upon hundreds of terms. And so the net result is people look at this and they see this giant XML schema, and your eyes kind of just roll back in your head, and as well they should. It's too much. Cybox 3.0, which Oasis is working on finalizing, is refactoring and simplifying it greatly. Same for Stix, which is kind of like an envelope around Cybox and other things. So that is going to help a lot, because they realized, like, look, we don't need a term for everything. We just need to tackle the most commonly used and commonly shared types of observables, and to do so effectively and well. Better to tackle the 80% really, really well than to worry about building a standard that encompasses the whole universe and becomes too difficult for people to use. The second is quantitative assessment of threat feeds, and this is really hard. Like I said before, no one is really doing this at any sort of scale, and so I looked to see if there were a lot of tools or good resources out there for quantitative assessment of threat data quality, and all I could find is something from the MLSec project. In 2014 or 13, Kyle Maxwell did a presentation about measuring the IQ of your threat feeds. They produced this tool called Tick Test that lets you do statistical comparison of network IOCs in your feeds and gives you a sense of how much overlap you have. And it's really interesting when you take a couple private feeds for pay, a couple public feeds, and find out that maybe the overlap is a much greater percentage than you expected. Challenge your threat feed vendor. As you're buying this stuff or evaluating or shopping around, consider where the data is coming from. Are they doing just open source threat intel collection? Are they using honeypots? Are they running managed services or professional services where they're seeing investigations and breaches in the field? All of these have strengths and weaknesses in terms of the scope and breadth and quality of data that you should consider. What is the breakdown of observable types? Like statistically, you should be able to get a number on what percentage of the items in your feeds are hashes, what percent are IPs, what percent are registry keys, so you know where to apply it and where it's going to be effective. And challenge them for what QC they have in place. How are they testing their indicators? How are they testing them to see if they produce false positives? Are they doing spot checking? Have they documented their feed such that you feel confident you can ingest it to spec? And then consider your own visibility. So are you really maximizing what you're paying for? Do you have the tooling in place to actually utilize threat data such that you have better visibility across your endpoints, your servers, and your network infrastructure? And are the two aligned? If you're consuming a ton of endpoint threat data and only looking really in your SIEM, which has network-centric logs, you're probably wasting your money. And you need to either shift the threat data you're buying or shift your tooling so that you have more endpoint visibility. And the same is true and vice versa. And then again, consider threat data in the grand scheme of things, in the grand sense of return on investment for security. The best sources of threat data are not going to help you keep pace with emerging attacks. There are always going to be attacks that are ahead of that curve, and there are always going to be things that you can more successfully identify by looking inside at your own environment, at the intelligence that your network intrinsically produces. Rob Joyce from the National Security Agency's Tailored Access Operations Group did a presentation at EnigmaCon earlier this year where he talked about how the NSA's worst nightmare is a sysadmin who pays attention. It's not a company that's got good threat data. It's people that understand what's going on in their systems and can find outliers and anomalies and spot behavior that is atypical. So knowing your network above all and investing in the security hygiene and attack surface reduction that shrinks opportunities for attackers will always provide a greater overall return on investment than just adding one more IOC source or one more source of threat data. All right, and with that, we have some time for questions. So thanks all, and happily take any questions you might have.